You are standing in a quiet room, holding a small wooden toy, a tiny pair of leather shoes, or a faded photograph. A crushing weight in your chest makes it difficult to draw a single breath. The loss of a child is universally recognized today as the deepest, most devastating grief a human being can experience. It fractures families, redefines identities, and leaves a hollow silence that time never fully heals. For centuries, a cynical assumption echoed through modern history books. Scholars claim that because infant mortality in the ancient world was so brutally high, with up to 50% of children dying before reaching adulthood, ancient parents simply hardened their hearts. They argued that hunter-gatherers could not afford the luxury of prolonged grief, that infants were replaceable, and that emotional investment only began when a child survived the vulnerable early years. But the real answer hidden in the ancient earth is far stranger, far deeper, and profoundly human. When archaeologists began unearthing the actual burial sites of our prehistoric ancestors, they did not find cold indifference. They found evidence of an agonizing, obsessive, and tender love that shattered every modern theory. Have you ever wondered if the grief you feel today is a modern invention or an ancient biological force that helped forge our very humanity? The answer begins over 70,000 years ago, deep inside a limestone cave, where a mother was forced to make a terrible choice. Imagine standing in Shanidar Cave, in the rugged mountains of modern-day Iraq. The year is roughly 60,000 years before the present day. The earth is cold, the wind howling across the valley below. Inside the cave, a group of Neanderthals sits around a dying hearth. In the center of the camp, a young child has stopped breathing. If the old scientific consensus were correct, a band of nomadic hunter-gatherers facing constant starvation would simply discard the body outside the cave entrance to prevent attracting apex predators like cave hyenas or cave lions. But evolutionary anthropologist Dr. Paul Pettit and his team analyzed the soil around these ancient remains and discovered something breathtaking. Microscopic pollen analysis revealed that the body of the child had been gently placed in a prepared trench. Surrounding the tiny skeleton were high concentrations of pollen from medicinal flowers, including yarrow, cornflower, and grape hyacinth. Someone had walked miles into the surrounding hills, gathered armfuls of bright, fragrant spring flowers, and lined the grave of a child who could no longer contribute to the tribe's survival. Why spend precious energy gathering flowers for a corpse in the middle of a brutal ice age? Because the human brain was already bound by the agonizing chains of attachment. To understand why ancient humans grieved so deeply, we have to look inside the modern human brain during loss. Evolutionary neuroscientists have conducted functional MRI brain scans on parents experiencing acute grief. When a parent loses a child, the brain does not process it merely as a psychological sad thought. The pain matrix of the brain fires intensely. The exact neural pathway that registers severe physical pain like a broken bone or a burning flame flashes red on the monitor. To your brain, grief is literally a physical wound. And this neural wiring is not a recent evolutionary upgrade. It is driven by oxytocin and dopamine neural loops that evolved millions of years ago to ensure human survival. Human infants are born completely helpless compared to other primates. A newborn chimpanzee can cling to its mother's fur within hours. A human infant cannot even hold up its own head. This prolonged infancy required human parents to develop an hyper-intense biological bonding mechanism. The evolutionary tax for this fierce, life-saving attachment is an equally fierce, debilitating agony when that bond is severed. Walk further back into prehistory, 78,000 years ago, to a site called Pangaya Saidi in modern-day Kenya. Here, archaeologists excavated the oldest known human burial in Africa. They found the skeleton of a 3-year-old child, whom researchers named Mtoto, meaning child in Swahili. Mtoto was buried with meticulous care. The child's tiny legs were drawn up toward its chest in a tight fetal position, wrapped tightly in a perishable shroud of skin or leaves. But the most heartbreaking detail lay under Mtoto's skull. Soil analysis showed that the child's head had been placed on a soft pillow crafted from perishable organic material. The neck vertebrae were still preserved in alignment, proving that the head had settled into the pillow as it decomposed. Think about that simple gesture. A mother or father standing over a shallow pit 78 millennia ago, making sure their deceased child's head was comfortable. They knew the child was dead. They knew the child could no longer feel cold or stone. Yet, the instinct to nurture, to protect, and to comfort completely overrode logic. But what happened when a band of nomadic hunter-gatherers had to pack up camp and move? A permanent grave in a cave works if you stay in one place. But mobile bands traveled hundreds of miles every year following game herds. Leaving a child's body buried in the dirt meant leaving part of your heart behind forever. Anthropologists studying traditional hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Juhonsi of the Kalahari and the Ake of Paraguay, uncovered a practice that haunted early European observers. When an infant died on the move, mothers would often carry the mummified or dried remains of their baby in their slings for weeks, months, or even years. They would hold the tiny corpse while walking across scorching deserts, touch the mummified hand during rest stops, and sing to it at night by the fire. Was this morbid insanity? No. It was a vital psychological bridge. The human brain's attachment system cannot simply be switched off by an act of will. Carrying the body allowed the mother's hormonal and neurological systems to slowly downregulate, easing the devastating shock of sudden separation. As human societies evolved from simple hunter-gatherer bands into complex ice age cultures, the way we treated lost children became astonishingly elaborate. Step into the famous Upper Paleolithic site of Sungyur, near Vladimir in modern-day Russia, dating back 30,000 years. Archaeologists uncovered a joint grave containing two children, a boy around 12 years old and a girl around 9. The cause of their deaths remains a mystery, but the effort invested in their final journey stunned the scientific world. The children were laid out side by side, head to head, in a long, shallow trench lined with red ochre pigment. Over 10,000 mammoth ivory beads were sewn directly onto their tailored leather clothing. Experimental archaeologists tried recreating these beads using period-accurate stone tools. They discovered that each single ivory bead took over 45 minutes of continuous hand carving to create. 10,000 beads meant over 7,000 hours of grueling physical labor. An entire tribe spent months, perhaps years, working around the clock to cover two dead children in a shimmering suit of ivory armor. Alongside the ivory beads were polished mammoth ivory spears, carved pendants, drilled fox canine teeth, and delicate bone needles. Why pour such vast material wealth into the earth for children who had not yet hunted a single mammoth or led a single raid? In many traditional societies, children are not viewed as incomplete humans waiting to become adults. They are viewed as the spiritual anchor of the entire lineage. To lose a child was not just a personal tragedy, it was a cosmic disturbance, a terrifying rift in the fabric of the community's universe. By showering the child with the tribe's most valuable treasures, ancient parents were sending a message into the unknown. This child was loved. This child belonged to us. Do not forget them. The red ochre pigment found in almost every ancient child burial tells an even deeper story. Red ochre is an iron oxide mineral that mimics the color and consistency of fresh blood. For tens of thousands of years, ancient humans painted the corpses of their children with brilliant red powder. Anthropologist Dr. Camilla Power has argued that red ochre served as a symbolic placeholder for life, blood, and rebirth. In the dark, cold earth of an ice age winter, covering a child in blood-red pigment was a symbolic act of returning the infant to a cosmic womb. It was a desperate, beautiful attempt to protect the child from the cold grayness of death, ensuring their spirit remained warm and vibrant in the afterlife. But what about children born with severe physical or genetic disabilities? Surely, in the harsh, unforgiving world of the Pleistocene, infants born unable to walk, hunt, or gather were abandoned. The archaeological record delivers a resounding answer: absolutely not. Consider the site of Romito Cave in Calabria, Italy, dating back 14,000 years. Archaeologists excavated the skeleton of a teenager known as Romito II. Romito II suffered from a severe form of dwarfism, known as acromegaly dysplasia. His arms and legs were severely shortened and malformed, making it impossible for him to hunt, forage, or keep up with a mobile tribe. Yet, chemical analysis of his bones proved he lived to be over 16 years old. The tribe had carried him across steep terrain, shared their precious meat with him, and protected him from predators for over a decade. When he died, he was buried in a tender embrace inside the cave, wrapped in the arms of an adult female, likely his mother. Another striking example comes from the site of Windover in Florida, dating back 8,000 years. Archaeologists unearthed the preserved remains of a 15-year-old boy who suffered from severe spina bifida. He was paralyzed from the waist down from the day he was born. For 15 years, his community carried him through damp, dangerous swamps, bathed him, kept his skin free from lethal pressure sores, and fed him soft foods. When he finally passed away, he was buried with extra care in a peat bog, wrapped in finely woven plant fabrics that required hundreds of hours to weave. These discoveries completely demolished the cold, utilitarian view of ancient human nature. Prehistoric humans did not value their children based on their economic output or physical utility. They valued them simply because they were theirs. But how did ancient parents cope with the overwhelming, everyday psychological shock of grief? Unlike modern humans, who often grieve in isolated homes behind closed curtains, ancient humans lived in hyper-connected, communal bands. In a hunter-gatherer camp of 25 people, privacy did not exist. Every tear, every scream, every silent sob was witnessed by the entire group. When a mother lost her baby, she did not grieve alone in a room. Anthropologists observing modern foraging groups like the Hadza of Tanzania note that when a child dies, the entire camp enters a state of collective mourning. Women gather around the grieving mother, holding her, swaying rhythmically, and joining in a shared, structured lamentation song. This collective lament is not just a ritual. It is a profound psychological safety net. Modern trauma specialists have discovered that processing acute grief requires co-regulation. When your nervous system is overwhelmed by catastrophic pain, your heart rate skyrockets, cortisol floods your bloodstream, and your brain enters a state of hyperarousal or dissociation. You cannot calm down on your own. By physically holding the grieving parent, breathing in rhythm, and chanting together, the tribe acts as an external nervous system. They absorb part of the shock wave, physically anchoring the parent back to reality, and preventing them from slipping into total psychological collapse. In many ancient cultures, this grief was given a physical, permanent form through body modification and scarification. Among historical indigenous groups across Australia, North America, and Siberia, parents who lost a child would cut their own hair, slash their arms or thighs with sharp flint flakes, or burn their skin to leave permanent scars. Why inflict physical pain on a body that is already suffering emotionally? Because physical pain is tangible, controllable, and temporary. Severe emotional grief is an invisible, overwhelming ghost that feels infinite. By cutting their skin, the parent translated an invisible, unbearable mental agony into a clear, localized physical wound that could bleed, scab, and eventually heal. When the physical wound healed, it left a scar, a permanent, visible mark on the skin that announced to the entire world, I carried a great loss. My love was real. As agriculture emerged 10,000 years ago during the Neolithic Revolution, human settlements grew larger, and the relationship with lost children took another extraordinary turn. In sites like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, people built permanent mud brick houses. But they did not build cemeteries outside the village walls. Instead, they buried their dead directly under the dirt floors of their own living rooms and bedrooms. Archaeologists excavating beneath the raised sleeping platforms of Çatalhöyük homes found dozens of infant and child skeletons carefully tucked into the foundation walls and subfloor pits. Imagine living, sleeping, cooking, and raising new infants directly above the resting places of your deceased children. Why would anyone want to sleep above the bodies of their lost children? Because to Neolithic parents, the wall between the living and the dead was thin and permeable. Burying a baby outside in the wild wilderness meant abandoning them to the cold monsters of the dark. Keeping them under the floorboards kept them inside the family home. When the family sat around the hearth at night, the lost child was still there, sheltered by the same walls, warmed by the same fire, remaining an active, present member of the household across generations. In ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, this refusal to let go of lost children evolved into tangible artifacts that survive to this day. In Roman Egypt, during the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, parents commissioned what are now known as the Fayum mummy portraits. When a young child died, wealthy families hired master painters to paint hyper-realistic, lifelike portraits of the child on wooden panels, which were then wrapped directly over the linen face of the mummy. Look into the wide, glowing eyes of a Fayum child portrait. You see tiny gold earrings, carefully curled dark hair, a subtle, sweet smile. The parents did not want to remember a cold corpse. They wanted to preserve the vibrant, breathing memory of their child for eternity. They wanted anyone who entered the tomb 2,000 years later to see their child exactly as they saw them at the breakfast table. In classical Greece, parents placed small ceramic vessels called lekithoi inside the graves of children. These white ground vases were painted with scenes of heartbreaking tenderness. A mother holding out a favorite toy bird to a child sitting on the bank of the river Styx, or a father reaching out his hand to touch a little girl who is stepping onto Charon's boat. In Greek mythology, the underworld was a cold, shadowy void. By placing these painted scenes in the tomb, parents were constructing a psychological shield, convincing themselves that their child would not be lonely in the dark, that they would have their favorite toys, and that the gods would treat them gently. But what about the quiet, unrecorded moments? What about the poor peasant, the Ice Age hunter, or the Neolithic farmer who did not have gold beads, red ochre, or painted vases? Archaeological sites across the globe have revealed small, deeply personal objects tucked into modest child graves. A polished river pebble with a natural hole through it. A tiny seashell carried hundreds of miles from the coast. A miniature clay animal crafted by hand, showing the tiny thumbprints of the adult who squeezed the wet clay. These were not grand religious offerings. These were toys. These were comfort objects. The ancient mother or father placed the child's favorite stone or carved bear into their small hand before covering them with earth, unable to bear the thought of their child waking up in the ground empty-handed. So when you look back through the vast, dark hallway of human prehistory, you do not see a cold, unfeeling species that treated children as disposable commodities. You see an unbroken chain of human beings who loved their children with a fierce, terrifying intensity. You see Pleistocene mothers gathering flowers in the snow. You see Ice Age fathers spending thousands of hours carving ivory beads for a tiny grave. You see communities carrying disabled children across mountains for 16 years. You see families sleeping above the bones of their babies to keep them warm. The high infant mortality of the ancient world did not make our ancestors feel less pain. It meant they lived in a constant state of profound, sacred vulnerability. They knew that life was fragile, that every breath was a gift, and that love was the only weapon human beings had against the cold darkness of the universe. So the next time you feel an overwhelming wave of love or protective anxiety for a child, or the deep, aching weight of a loss you thought you had to carry alone, remember where that feeling comes from. It is not a modern weakness. It is the ancient, fire-forged superpower that kept our species alive through glaciers, droughts, and dark nights. You are carrying the exact same heart that wept under the stars 70,000 years ago, proving that while empires crumble and technologies fade, a parent's love remains the most enduring force on Earth.